that nexus had to be broken. And the only way to do that was to actually involve the employees in the change program itself, rather than shove something down their throat and say, do this or else.
Welcome to Process Pioneers, the show that takes a deep dive into the minds of decision makers, key influencers, and process experts who are pioneering the world of everything process. Welcome to the next episode of Process Pioneers. My name is Daniel Rayner. I'm the host of Process Pioneers, and this may be your first time listening to this series. You may be listening to all of our episodes, in which case you would have listened to about 140 odd episodes or so, or thereabouts. So we've been doing this series for the past 2 years, and I've had the privilege of sitting down with many different individuals that have an expertise or are specialized in the world or the topic of business process management, whether they come from an academic realm, whether they come from a consulting lens, whether they're working internally at large organizations, helping them to transform their business processes. We've certainly had many very insightful conversations on this channel. Business process management is such a broad subject and covers many different areas. And obviously it's evolved and advanced quite a lot over the past 10, 15, 20 years, particularly with technology. But if you have been enjoying this series, I would ask you, it would be, we would really appreciate it if you could give us a rating and a review on whatever channel or platform that you're listening to this podcast right now, whether it's YouTube, Apple, Google Podcasts, any of those. A rating means a whole lot to us because it means that the podcast is going to get out to an even wider and broader audience, which is fantastic because we're all about educating people on this topic of business process management. Now, in today's episode, I have the absolute privilege of sitting down with Geoff Whiteley. Now, Geoff is an Australian expat who is focusing on business process management in the APAC market. And it's, from conversations I've had with quite a range of people, I've I guess, understood over time that different areas of the world, different regions of the world tackle business process management differently, not necessarily maybe a different approach, but maybe just at a different level of process maturity in terms of challenges and what they're facing. And so this will be a really interesting conversation where we're with Geoff, where we get to focus on this particular region, the APAC region. But Geoff particularly has it has been focusing on the Indonesian market in particular. So very excited for this conversation. Geoff, thanks for joining me.
Thanks, Daniel. Thanks to your audience as well for being here to hear what we've got to talk about.
So what might be good to kick things off with is if you can tell us, how did you get started in this world of business process management? Because, with the range of guests I've had on this show, oftentimes there's quite a unique entry into the BPM world. And it'll be great to hear your journey, where you got started from when it comes to business process management, and take us on a bit of a journey leading up to what you're doing today.
Okay. Well, my exposure to BPM began when I was employed by a major international airline that was conducting a strategic trainee program as part of their investment to preserve generations of corporate knowledge that was held by senior personnel that were approaching retirement. So this investment was about preserving and protecting that corporate asset. The program's formal training that I was part of covered the entire airline value stream, from strategic route planning, provisioning for new aircraft, acquiring and supplying replacement parts in support of the fleet size and the flying hours of that fleet, through to the commercial objective, the ultimate goal of an airline, which is to put bums in seats. Excuse the expression, but that's what the airline industry refers to, seats for sale. After graduating from that training program, I was assigned to modern IT systems development in support of the strategic operations that were emerging with the new levels of ways of running an airline and the fleets and the whole systems that were being used to make the airline function effectively. That involved designing processes for spare parts procurement, demand forecasting, supply logistics, and then developing and implementing those new systems. And that was a project which ran over quite a number of years, and it was a very, very large investment on the part of that airline. From there, I progressed to the IT industry in a corporate advisory capacity, and followed that by working in transformation consulting relating to the emergence of the ERP and other major corporate IT investments. So in summary, I've been privileged to have had a solid background of making things work according to a strategic view, executing the objectives of major business and government enterprises. And that exposure over many cycles of technology over the decades and major operational transformation cycles has provided me with the knowledge and experience to help guide and avoid the tendency for new programs to overrun or miss their mark. And that happens all too often, as we're only too well aware. I'm currently based in Indonesia to address the vibrant and rapidly growing awareness of the need for BPM, which extends actually across the ASEAN region, but at different levels of maturity, as you pointed out. That's my story.
That's fantastic. Thanks for that, Geoff. So talking about the Indonesian market and there being an appetite there, what would you say is the most common drivers of adopting BPM? Because obviously, as we mentioned, different regions have been focusing on BPM for 5, 10, 15, 20 years, depending where you're looking in the world. When you're looking at this Indonesian market in particular, and you just mentioned there that there's all of a sudden quite an appetite, what's driving this appetite, would you say?
Well, yeah, most organisations anywhere, but in Indonesia in particular, have an incomplete or an outdated view of what's happening at their front line. With the advent of the pandemic over the last couple of years, that was sort of brought home loud and clear that they needed to understand more about what their operations were actually doing in order to be able to make change, effective change. So in this context, the way that people work is typically a series of informal acts that are driven by an individual's personal knowledge about their job. And rather than that knowledge being developed as a corporate asset, employees tend to retain it either in their head or it's in static hard copy documentation. It's rarely, if ever, analysed and optimised for alignment with corporate strategy. And as I said, the pandemic has made that issue very prominent in the minds of senior executives. But even more alarming, with that unrecognised knowledge or unrecorded knowledge, it walks out the door with departing employees. So it's a huge opportunity for organisations to get with the program, if you like, in terms of being more agile and adaptable and to know what needs to be changed and when it needs to be changed. With the relentless disruptive changes happening in all countries today, organisations simply can't function at their peak unless that knowledge is harvested, analysed, reviewed, updated, and published through an online repository, ideally. This enables an organisation to use that knowledge to support rapid, informed decision-making to address changes in markets, competitors, operations, corporate goals, or pandemics. This is the central and the most significant single contribution to making transformation successful and produce sustainable benefits. So those issues are becoming more visible to Indonesian executives. And that varies from industry to industry. But at a senior level, they recognise the problem, but don't necessarily recognise the solution.
Yes, okay. And why would you say that, as in, what's the reasoning there? What's the gap in between understanding maybe what the problem is, but not quite realising what the solution is?
Partly, that's a great question. Partly it's cultural. It's also evolutionary. I mean, it's a matter of where a country's economy is at a particular point in the timeline. But overcoming a culture that hasn't placed a value yet on individual knowledge and experience instead of an open and collaborative environment that calls things for what they really are, that's an underlying problem in many cultures. In Australia, the same. You have companies that just don't recognise the fact that their employees know what they're doing and don't talk about it. Incredibly, some organisations' management only wants to hear about good news. I could tell you a story about that, but that'd take too long. But how does a manager turn bad news into good news if they discourage their team from uncovering the bad stuff? So that, to go back to your question, that's really what's underlying or preventing, blocking, whatever you want to call it, the adoption of a real solution. So if you recognise that those employees with their on-the-job know-how and they're individuals who deal with customers and suppliers every minute of every day, they know when and how things are going wrong, and they're the best source of knowledge for making things go right. So bringing that knowledge together into a community environment, a collaborative environment within the organisation, instead of maintaining an authoritarian or hierarchical culture which tolerates, that's the way we've always been done, so let's keep on doing it that way. The best way to eliminate bad news is to harness employee knowledge and turn the bad news into good. Without that approach, transformation becomes just another exercise to be seen doing something, but in doing that, the results will be ineffective. So it's about getting collaboration and recognising an employee's contribution to the way things work.
That's great. There are some people that will be listening to this series and in particular this episode that maybe they're part of an organization with a lower level of process maturity. So they've never actually, seen the full power or the full extent of what BPM can deliver for an organization. I guess tying back into what you were saying before, with the senior leaders, there being a bit of a gap there in terms of knowing what the problem is, but not understanding how to solve that problem. I think one thing that the audience would be encouraged to hear is whether you have some specific wins you can share with us where you've been involved in business process management in some way, shape or form, whether on a micro level or a macro level. You've been working with an organization, whether internally or whether as a consultant, and it's actually, delivered maybe above and beyond what the organization was expecting, or it really played a significant part in supporting the organization to meet their strategic objectives?
Well, two experiences spring to mind there. One was with a mobile telecom operator. As most of those technology-based companies do, their infrastructure was outsourced to a third party for maintenance and upgrading and so forth. But the processes between the customer front end, which was like the helpline, I've got a problem with my mobile, I'm calling you to help fix it. The link between that front line and the back end, which was the third party engineering and maintenance operation, those lines basically were broken. So we came in and joined up joined the dots between the front and back line, if you like. Unfortunately, that particular company was losing hundreds of thousands of subscribers every month because of that problem. They simply weren't getting the reliability and the speed of response. So we were able to cut that off or to stem that flow of blood by joining the front end with the back end. Another example in the logistics sector, a major seaport operator had been the subject of massive industrial disruption over decades. Basically, the unions were running the company, was the best way to describe it. New investors had come in, some from overseas, and they insisted that nexus had to be broken. And the only way to do that was to actually involve the employees in the change program itself, rather than shove something down their throat and say, do this or else. The process was to get them engaged in the need for change. Over a period of about 18 months. Critical processes were mapped. A repository was created. Those processes were put into that repository and made available to all of the employees on the dock, on the front line. So they knew exactly what their role was. They knew what to do when something went wrong. Whereas before, it was just Rafferty's rules, to use the Australian expression. If something went wrong, well, either sweep it under the carpet or, do something else about it. But bringing all those things together from the operational end through to the managerial and through managers to the customers completely transformed that organisation in the period of about 18 months.
Yeah. That's amazing. That's great. Thanks for sharing that. And I think you mentioned engaged in the need for change. I think that's so important when it comes to adopting BPM across the organization, because, it's not just about the analysts. It's not just about the technical people. Everyone in the organization is involved in some way to a process, whether you're at the coalface, so to speak, whether you're middle management, senior leadership, everything we do is through a process. And so we need to be able to bring many stakeholders along that journey, and I guess open their eyes to the need for change and the need for improvement and the need for having that transparency to understand where are we currently and where do we want to go.
That's very true, and in fact, it's fundamental to making a transformation successful. If you were to do a scientific study on those that failed, 99% of the time, you would find that there's a lack of consultation with the employees at the front line. That would have contributed to it almost definitely. And the other thing is that without involving those employees in the change that needs to be done and how the change needs to be enacted, means that if you don't involve them, they say, well, to hell with that. I'm just going to keep on doing things the way I always did it. And then the program just falls on its backside and doesn't work.
Yeah. And how do you bring them along for the journey, especially when you're maybe working with individuals where there hasn't been a huge culture of change, so change is maybe foreign to them. They've been doing the same tasks and activities the same way for the past 2, 3, 5, 10 years, and then all of a sudden we're coming in and we're flipping everything on its head, and all of this kind of maybe, I don't know what the term or the word would be, but this knowledge they have where that they can just do it without really thinking about it because they've done it for so long. And now as process practitioners, we're coming in saying, hey, there's actually going to be a better way. And we also want to mitigate the risk of when you leave, John, when you leave the company, you're going to take so many, you mentioned it earlier, so much knowledge with you. We need to be, planning for our future. So, because I asked the question because I know people will, it's change management isn't easy. Bringing people along for the journey sometimes isn't easy. So how do you work with those people to, I guess, make sure you have as much buy-in as possible?
You've hit the nail on the head, frankly. In many cases, they suffer from transformation fatigue. This might be the third or fourth or fifth time that the management, has brought about a change program. But what they often or invariably fail to do in those change programs is to consult with the front line and engage with them. Now, the reality is that not all of those people will be overjoyed about the fact that change is coming. Many of them have been there for years and they'll say, oh, here we go again, another change program. But within that population, there will be people who are prepared to go along for the ride. And what happens is that everybody watches what they do. And when things start to produce results, people want to get involved because it's not just another change program this time around. It's actually producing a result that's making their lives better. They're getting less harassment from customers or unhappy customers. They're getting less beaten around the head by suppliers who are wanting to get paid because the processes of procure to pay hasn't worked properly. So it makes their life so much easier once they start to see what the benefits of the change are, that you've got to work with that nucleus of positive people. The ones who are negative or who are suffering from change fatigue, you treat them with kid gloves, but you neither ignore them, but you try to coach them and involve them into becoming part of the success rate. And that's a process that takes time.
No, that's good. And you've already touched on this a little bit, but what are the biggest objections to a BPM approach? So, when an organization is ready to adopt this management approach across the enterprise, we've already talked about, bringing people along for the journey, but what are some of those key objections that will need to be managed?
Yeah. There's many of those, but and there's too many to cover in full here. But to pick on some of the top line, the highlights, if you like, I spoke to an organisation here in Jakarta who has a business improvement section within their administrative office, and their first comment was, "Well, we've already mapped all our processes." When in fact they've only done high-level workflow diagrams, and they're neither accurate nor up-to-date nor relevant to what's actually going on at the front line. It's just a high-level view of, pass this thing to that. But that was the initial response. We've already mapped all our processes. I asked how many, and they said, about 500. They've got no idea about prioritising, strategising, and focusing on where the impact and the results are going to come from. The other one that comes up a lot is, well, we don't have time to go to all that detail. Our IT department are delivering a new system, and we've got to devote our attention to that implementation. In Australia, there was a very famous example of that happening. It was a major healthcare organisation, and it was under the control or the guidance of a multinational technology consulting firm. But somewhere along the line, they failed to consult with one aspect of their HR and payroll systems. And once the IT system was in and they slammed it in as quickly as they could, they suddenly realised they'd forgotten about a critical aspect of the payroll. So forgetting or overlooking the fact that you need to look at what's actually going on today before we talk about what we need to be doing tomorrow is a huge mistake, and it happens too often. And the other one is, we've got our people, they'll do it. They overlook the fact that our people have got a day job. And they very quickly become tired of trying to make change when there's problems that they've got to address. And it goes back to what we were talking about before, about consulting with the front line. And the way we do that is we'll come to that later. Another one is, we've already defined our processes. They never change. And you can guarantee that organisation don't have a library. They don't have a complete compendium or repository of their existing processes, but they never change. So that's just a few of the things that people come up with. There's lots more. But fundamentally, it all hinges around that human-centred approach, that if you involve the people, get them on board, get them to contribute and identify where the changes need to be made and prioritise that, things will happen much more quickly and much more effectively.
That's great. That's really good. And what now, I guess, looking forward to over the next 2, 3, 5 years, what does the future look like for BPM? And not necessarily from, say, a technology point of view, because, there are, as I mentioned earlier, that there's such a diverse, broad range of process maturity. Some organizations are heavily into process mining, heavily into data analytics, heavily into robotic process automation and these different types of technology. And there are some organizations out there that, as we've already discussed, nothing's being documented, nothing's currently being managed. But when you look to the next 2, 3, 5 years, what are the most important things for organizations to be considering or to be aware of when it comes to managing with a BPM approach?
Well, whilst technology is not the be all and the wherewithal, if you like, in terms of achieving a successful business process optimization, operational excellence, whatever terminology you like to use. Technology does play a key role. But today, and as we move now into the second half or towards the second half of the 2020s, technology has become more available and cheaper to operate and maintain than it's ever been. The advent of cloud computing has turned most of the major software vendors to a software as a service approach rather than an on-premises all-you-can-eat license, which costs historically tens or even hundreds of millions of dollars. Now we're looking at technology that's available for $100 a month or those sorts of numbers. But in conjunction with that, the technology is getting smarter than it's ever been. Artificial intelligence, which is a big black box to me, but it's showing its ability to predict things that humans would take years to understand. So in the areas of discovery in the current process documentation phase, AI can play a huge role there. And you mentioned robotic process automation. More and more artificial intelligence in that regard will start to make it easier and quicker and more effective for organizations to understand what they're actually doing today so they can work out what they should be doing tomorrow and the next day. So, there's, as I say, the technology is inextricably linked, but it's the enabler, it's not the catalyst or the driver.
Yes.
So, and in this region, I would see that that's an area of priority in terms of the understanding of how to achieve results, to keep IT simply as the tool to make things happen rather than the driver to decide where we go with transformation. If that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's so important, and I think it's really key to understand the purpose of adopting technology or for wanting to manage your business processes, because I think there are many organizations out there that have jumped at different technologies, or even mapped their entire, hundreds of business processes, but without a clear why are we doing this behind it. And so they're doing all of this sort of grunt work. They get to the end of that 12-month or 18-month exercise, and then they have all this documentation just sitting there that actually never gets looked at again, because there was no clear why behind why were we doing all of that work, the purpose behind why we were doing that. And then in some cases it gives business process management a bad name or a poor taste in people's mouths, because they've had a bad introduction to it. They've had a bad experience of it, and it's just been poorly done.
Well, that's exactly right. And historically, and probably still today to some extent, there's this attitude of, well, the technology will fix it. And the processes are sort of lumped on somebody's job role, and the person who's doing that job says, hang on a minute, that's not what I do. And the thing starts to fall apart and pieces start falling off from that moment on, without consulting with the people up front, without taking into account, and going back to the point about the future and artificial intelligence and so forth, taking into account the way things are done today, understanding what's wrong or what's right about that, and taking the best of it and getting rid of the worst and adding the new features and the new directions. But most importantly, being able to adapt that at the, on the drop of a hat, to use that terminology, because change is happening so quickly now, more quickly than it's ever done, and it will continue to increase in pace. So you've got to be able to make change rapidly, but in sympathy with what's actually going on at the front line today.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And I think in such a brief conversation, we can only really touch on a number of these topics on a very sort of high level of detail. But, I'm sure that in our conversation, you've certainly piqued interest in our audience in terms of process management, what's possible, what's been done before, how to best approach it or how to best tackle it. But where would you encourage those that are listening to go to, I guess, further learn about BPM and what it can do for their particular organisation?
Well, these sessions, I think, are a good start, quite frankly, because it's down to earth. It's not sort of preaching to the unconverted. It's practical, but I think it's a matter of making sure that executives, management, and the people that are doing the job take the approach of thinking big about what the approach, what the transformation needs to be. That's starting small. Trying to take on too much too soon with too many is a recipe for failure. So to answer your question, where would you go? What we do is help organisations identify what their priorities should be based on their strategy, based on the pressures they're under from a competitive or from a environmental point of view, if it's COVID driven. But to prioritise and to focus on the high volume, high value, high impact processes that are going to make results and change more effective in a shorter space of time. So when people see those results coming out, within the space of 10, 12 weeks, they get enthusiastic, they get excited about it, and they want to do more. And that's where the thinking big but starting small aspect comes in. Don't take on too much too soon. Work on what you can produce a result from within that 10 to 12 week period, even 8 weeks in some cases. That's pretty rare, but it can happen. And move on from there.
That's great. And for those that maybe you've left people with further questions that they want to connect with you and sort of flesh out some of these topics further, what's the best way for our audience to get in touch with yourself?
That's another great question. We have a website. We have email, of course, and info@qiplus-hpo.com. We'd be very pleased to learn about your listeners' thoughts, their ideas, and to tell us about their problems, because we can't fix everybody's, but we'd like to try. But we'd like to talk about how we can approach that before we come up with any remedies or proposed solutions. We offer a free orientation workshop, which is up to half a day. Sometimes it can be as quick as 2-3 hours, and a free trial of this BPM software. So organisations can get that done without any financial commitment. We've conducted programs like that have run 6 to 8 weeks, just on a pilot basis. Now, one of those was with a government department in New South Wales. They'd recognised the need for simplifying the interaction between government agencies and small businesses. The small businesses were being snowed under with red tape. So in 6-7 weeks, we identified where the red tape was. We identified which of the red tape was important, which of the red tape was unimportant, and worked with their people to solve those problems and put in a much more better system. That concept in that particular aspect of government in Australia has spread to a huge online kiosk, approaching the level of sophistication that you would see if you went to Singapore. I don't know whether you've ever seen their online government system in Singapore. They've got kiosks all around the city. So if you need to renew your license or pay for a dog tag or anything to do with government, you can just walk up to one of these kiosks and do it. So that project that we did in Australia with small business licensing was the heart of it, led to a major online initiative for driver's license, birth, deaths and marriage, registration, anything to do with life cycle events. So again, what we do, we approach on, or we focus on, condensing the project down to its lowest common denominator, getting the work done, getting the people involved, and seeing the results within the shortest possible time. And that way, it helps people get on board and want to have an appetite for more.
That's fantastic. Well, for everyone that is listening to this episode, if you've enjoyed my conversation with Geoff today, I'd encourage you to please leave a comment, leave a rating, leave a review. Let us know what you liked about the episode. Give us your thoughts and opinions. We'd love to engage in a conversation with you. And also, this is our first conversation with Geoff, but certainly not our last. We do have a number of other conversations planned for the future where we'll be inviting other guests into the conversation as well for more specific conversations around certain topics, BPM in Indonesia as one of those topics that we're working on at the moment. So, Geoff, I just want to thank you for sitting down with me today. I've certainly been gleaning a lot from our conversation, albeit a very brief conversation, and I'm sure the audience has as well. Thank you so much. It's been an absolute privilege.
Thanks for the opportunity, Daniel. Much appreciated.